Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The person you believe will cheer you on the loudest might be the very one who has been quietly slipping obstacles under your feet, and when the mask comes off in front of everyone you thought you needed to impress, you suddenly realize the only thing left to do is decide whether you want to keep begging for their approval or finally stand up and own what is yours without apology. The night was supposed to be simple, a quiet dinner to mark a milestone I had worked years toward, the kind of night that should have been about congratulations, a toast, maybe even a little relief. Because God knows I had carried the weight of proving myself in that company longer than I care to admit, and now, finally, I had earned the title, the raise, the validation that my work had mattered. I had invited my parents because, against my better judgment, I still wanted them to see me as more than the fallback kid, the one who handled the details while my sister Brooke chased the spotlight. I told myself it was just dinner, that even if they couldn't say the words outright, maybe sitting at that table while my boss recognized me would make it undeniable that I had achieved something real. The evening moved along in that predictable, slightly awkward rhythm where I carried the conversation while my mom smiled politely and my dad steered every anecdote back to Brooke. I had almost convinced myself to just let it slide, to not let it sting, because I had learned to take whatever scraps of acknowledgement I could get. But then, as my boss Maya raised her glass to say something kind, my dad chuckled in that way he does when he thinks he's being witty, leaned back in his chair, and dropped the line that sliced the air in half. "Too bad your sister couldn't make it. She's the real star." I felt the words in my chest like a punch, the same script I'd been hearing my whole life, the quiet rewriting of every achievement I managed into a footnote to Brooke's story. But before I could react, before the burn in my throat turned into something I'd regret saying, Maya didn't miss a beat. She set her glass down, reached into her bag, and with a calmness that was almost surgical, pulled out a crisp envelope. She slid it across the table toward me, glanced at my dad, and said with a steady voice, "Funny, she thought so too, until I fired her today." The silence that followed was louder than any argument we'd ever had in that family. My dad's face drained of color, his jaw actually trembling as his hand hovered like he might snatch the letter, but couldn't quite bring himself to touch it. My mom gasped softly, eyes darting between us, desperate to stitch the evening back together with some empty phrase, but there was no sewing this up. I opened the letter, scanning the formal language, each sentence confirming what Maya had just delivered out loud: breach of confidentiality, misuse of client information, termination effective immediately. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, like finally the truth had been dragged into the light in front of the one man who had always chosen not to see me. But what I felt was sharper, almost crueler, not because Brooke had been caught, but because the look on my dad's face told me he wasn't shocked at her actions. He was shocked that she had consequences. In that instant, I understood what I had always refused to admit. The rules had never been the same for us, and in his eyes they never would be. Maya leaned closer to me, her voice low but deliberate, and said, "Lauren, this isn't the end of it. We still have one more problem to solve tomorrow." She slid a flash drive across the table, her expression unreadable but firm. My father's hand twitched again, like he wanted to speak, to challenge, to defend Brooke, but for once no words came out. I took the flash drive, tucked it into my bag, and felt a strange calm settle over me. For years, I had walked into these moments hoping my family would finally change their script, hoping that if I just achieved enough, produced enough, endured enough, they would finally acknowledge me without a but or a too bad. That night, watching my dad pale and my mom fumble, I realized the script wasn't going to change on its own. If there was going to be a rewrite, I would have to be the one holding the pen. When the bill came, I didn't let my dad reach for it, didn't let my mom make her usual protest. I put my new company card down, looked the server in the eye, and asked for the check to be split, one for my dinner, one for theirs. It was a small thing, almost petty, but it mattered. I wasn't paying for their story anymore. As we stood to leave, my dad finally found his voice, muttering something about Brooke needing time to bounce back, but I didn't respond. I hugged my mom quickly, nodded to my dad, and turned toward the door. Behind me, I heard Maya's steady footsteps and her quiet words, "Tomorrow, we'll settle it once and for all." And that was the moment it hit me. The night wasn't about closure, it was about opening a door I had been too afraid to even touch. What waited on that flash drive wasn't just company business, it was the truth I had been circling for years. And tomorrow, I'd finally see it for myself. The morning after the dinner felt heavy in a way that wasn't just about sleep or the lingering sting of my father's words, but because I carried with me a weight I had refused to acknowledge for far too long. The realization that the people who were supposed to be my safety net, the ones whose approval I had been chasing in every accomplishment, every promotion, every quiet success, had never treated me as an equal. And that night had crystallized it in a way that no subtle comment, no backhanded compliment, no dismissive laugh ever could. And yet, just when I thought I could collect myself and move on, my phone buzzed with a notification that made my stomach not tighter than it had in years, because there it was, at the top of my screen. A message from my sister Brooke that I had never expected to see, and even now I can feel the pulse in my chest as I remember opening it, knowing that whatever came next could undo any semblance of composure I had managed to hold through. The awkward dinner. The message itself was deceptively casual in tone, the kind of message someone sends when they know they hold power but want to disguise it as harmless, almost playful, and the words were short but sharp, a dagger wrapped in sugar. "Thanks, Mom and Dad. Can't wait to take it for a spin. XOXO." Attached was a photo, a glossy, perfectly angled image of the car I had been told as a kid was just a dream we would never afford, a car that was now wrapped in a giant bow and parked in their driveway like a trophy. A public statement that somehow my achievements meant less than a gift handed freely to my sister, a gift I would have had to fight, negotiate, or even bribe my way into getting, and for a moment, the room I sat in seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as I tried to breathe. Without breaking. I stared at the image and the words over and over, each glance intensifying a combination of disbelief, anger, and that old, familiar ache of betrayal that I had carried in quiet, muted waves for years. A weight I had buried under accomplishments and the false hope that my parents would eventually see me as deserving, as equal, as their child in name and respect. Not just a convenient extension of their moral ledger to praise when convenient and ignore when inconvenient, and in that moment, I realized that every achievement, every milestone I had tried to share with them was already tainted by their choices, already filtered through a lens that favored my sister without question or hesitation. I didn't reply to the message, not immediately, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to breathe, to let the initial surge of anger settle into something I could manage, to transform the raw emotional jolt into something that felt more like clarity than chaos. And as I sat there with my phone in my hand, I felt the weight of 5 birthdays, 5 milestones, 5 moments where their absence, indifference, or outright favoritism had spoken louder than any words could, each one stacking on top of the other, building a wall between us that I had tried to ignore, but that now loomed tall and undeniable. I thought about calling them, about voicing the hurt I had carried silently for so long, but I knew the moment I did, the conversation would inevitably pivot, as it always had, to excuses, to defensiveness, to the subtle shifting of blame that left me once again holding the weight of being the unreasonable one, the one who expected too much, the one who couldn't be grateful enough for scraps of attention, and I realized that this time, I couldn't allow that to happen. That my response could not be filtered through their familiar patterns of denial and dismissal, because if I did, it would be just another victory for the script they had always imposed, and I refused to play that role any longer. Instead, I decided to act in a way that I had never allowed myself before, a deliberate, quiet assertion of boundaries that would be immediately visible but impossible to misinterpret. A response that said without words that I would no longer allow their choices to dictate my worth, my emotions, or the way I define my relationships with them, and so, with a calmness that surprised even me, I blocked my parents and my sister from my social media, removed their numbers from my phone, and took a deep breath, feeling the sharp sting of isolation intermixed with a sense of liberation, The paradoxical relief of finally cutting the cord on a family dynamic that had never been fair, never been equal, and had repeatedly undermined me in ways too subtle to confront until now. 2 days later, the knock on my door was the sound I had been bracing for but had not fully anticipated, and when I opened it, there was my mother, tears streaming down her face, her expression pleading and fractured in a way that no amount of past disappointment could have prepared me for, and as she stood there, shivering slightly, words tumbling out of her mouth in a jumble of apology and desperation, I realized that the story had shifted once again, that the power dynamic I had been trying to reclaim had been thrown into an unpredictable chaos where I now held the choice, the authority, and the clarity to decide not just how to respond, but whether to forgive, whether to rebuild, or whether to walk away forever. And as I closed the door on her frantic pleas, I felt the weight of every past injustice lift slightly, replaced by the sobering, humbling awareness that for the first time, the outcome depended entirely on me. When I finally sat down across from my parents that weekend, still raw from my mother's porch scene and that image of the bow-wrapped car burning behind my eyes like a brand I couldn't scrub off, I told myself I would keep the conversation neutral, rational, and grounded, that I would not let old wounds turn into fresh arguments, that I would not be baited into another emotional spiral that ended with me questioning my own reactions while everyone else walked away untouched. But the second my Dad started talking, before I'd even touched the cup of coffee I didn't want but accepted anyway just to avoid a debate about how I always act like a guest, I could already feel the familiar script unfolding, the setup, the rehearsed phrasing that always led to some new obligation cloaked in sentiment, and the moment the phrase, "We just need a little help, nothing crazy," left his mouth, I knew exactly where this was headed. And the part of me that used to feel trapped by those conversations suddenly switched into something sharper, something surgical, because I wasn't just going to sit there and not anymore, not after everything. My father didn't come right out and say the words at first, he never did. Instead, he danced around the topic like a man performing on a tightrope he didn't want to admit existed, talking about how Brooke was figuring things out, how transitions can be messy after a job loss, how family pulls together in hard times, especially successful family members who have a little extra now, and as he said it, he tried to smile in that way he always had, the kind of half-smile that pretended this was all casual, all reasonable, all just part of being a good daughter, but I had stopped believing in that smile a long time ago, and this time, I had come prepared. I let him speak without interrupting, not because I agreed, not because I respected the speech, but because I wanted to make sure I heard every word, every twist of logic, every manipulative turn of phrase that he would later swear I'd misunderstood. And when he finally said it, when he finally asked me to co-sign a loan Brooke needed to consolidate her debts and launch some small business idea she was passionate about, I didn't flinch, I didn't argue, I didn't even raise my voice, I just reached into my bag, pulled out the folder I had been carrying since the dinner, and placed it flat on the table between us, sliding it across the surface with the kind of calm precision that made both of them pause. Inside the folder wasn't anything dramatic, no legal threat, no shocking accusation, just a simple, notarized letter I had written and signed, stating clearly that I would not be co-signing any loans, not now, not ever, that I would not be financially entangled with any family member, and that any request of that nature would be met with silence, not argument, not negotiation, just absence, and as I watched my father read it, his face shifting from confusion to disbelief to insult, I realized that this was the first time I had ever made a boundary visible enough that he couldn't pretend not to see it, and the discomfort on his face wasn't about the money or the rejection, it was about the loss of control. My mother tried to soften it, of course. She always did, her voice low, her tone sad, asking me if I really had to be so formal, if I really couldn't just talk this through like a family, and for a split second I almost caved, because that's what they do best. They wear you down with familiarity, with guilt, with memories of birthdays and scraped knees and Christmas mornings that feel like anchors when you try to swim away from people who never learn to see you as a full person with limits, but I didn't cave. Not this time, because I had finally learned that drawing a line only means something if you're willing to enforce it when it's tested. I looked at my mother, then my father, and said the words as steadily as I could. You gave Brooke a car. You asked me to help clean up the fallout from her own mistakes. You skipped 5 birthdays. You've skipped every part of my life that wasn't convenient. I don't owe you my signature. I don't owe you another version of the same mistake. For a few long seconds, the room was dead quiet, not because they agreed, but because they didn't know what to say to a version of me that didn't fold, didn't flinch, didn't beg to be heard. And as I stood up to leave, my dad's voice finally cracked through the silence, laced with that dry, brittle anger that only ever showed up when things didn't go the way he planned. So that's it? You'd rather watch your sister sink? I didn't even turn around. I just replied, I watched her push me under for years, and you cheered her on. If she's sinking now, maybe it's because no one ever taught her how to swim without dragging someone else down. As I walked to the door, my mother tried one last play, pulling a piece of paper from her purse with trembling fingers, saying that Brooke had asked her to pass it along to me, just something she thought I should see. And when I took it and unfolded it right there in the hallway, I felt a fresh pulse of disbelief rise through me, because what I saw wasn't an apology, wasn't a request, wasn't anything close to remorse. It was a screenshot of a draft social media post, full of accusations. That I had stolen her promotion, that I had manipulated our boss, that the company had caved to corporate politics, and that my success wasn't earned. It was inherited through favoritism and sabotage. There was no signature, no explanation, just a half-written smear designed to go live the moment I said no, and suddenly everything made sense. The car, the dinner absence, the desperate scramble for a loan. It wasn't just about Brooke starting over. It was about controlling the narrative before the truth buried her. I folded the paper, placed it in my bag next to the notarized letter, looked my mother in the eye, and said, "Tell her if she posts this, I won't be the one who looks bad." And as I walked out, the only thought that kept echoing in my mind wasn't fear, or regret, or even anger. It was a steady, cold realization that the next move was mine. And I wasn't going to waste it. There's something uniquely exhausting about knowing you're right, having the receipts to prove it, but still being forced to defend yourself against a version of the story that's louder, messier, and more emotionally convenient for everyone else. Because while you're sitting there assembling timelines and facts, the other person is already busy spinning feelings into weapons, counting on the idea that people believe what moves them emotionally more than what stands up on paper. And in that moment, holding Brooke's draft post in my hands, reading her careful phrasing about toxic work culture and career sabotage and how certain people had weaponized their closeness to leadership, I realized she wasn't just threatening my job or my reputation. She was counting on being seen as the victim first, knowing that in the court of public opinion, the first version of a story to go viral is the one most people remember, no matter what evidence comes out after. It wasn't panic I felt, not exactly, but a kind of grim awareness that this was no longer just about family, or even the power dynamics inside a home that had always run on uneven rules, but about a reputation I had spent years building through late nights, over-delivered projects, and the kind of silence that lets louder people think they've won. And I knew that if she clicked post before I acted, it would become another fire I'd have to put out while pretending not to be burned. So I didn't waste time. I walked straight into the office the next morning, not into a meeting room or a manager's office, but directly to HR, because I had learned by now that the only way to win a war with someone who plays dirty is to stay cleaner, louder, and one step ahead. Not by stooping, but by documenting. Kevin, our HR director, didn't flinch when I handed him the folded printout and gave him a calm, straight retelling of how it landed in my hands, what preceded it, and what would likely happen if no action was taken. He didn't ask condescending questions. He didn't make me prove the context. He simply nodded, opened a shared folder, and pulled up the employee record that had been opened for Brooke the day Maya let her go, a file that was already thick with time-stamped emails, client complaint summaries, and internal notes showing she had been quietly undermining key accounts by leaking selective information to clients through back channels she never should have had access to in the first place. "Do you want this escalated to legal?" Kevin asked, and I said yes, not because I wanted a lawsuit, not because I needed revenge in the courtroom, but because I wanted an official trail that couldn't be spun by family politics or deleted Instagram captions. Something no one could explain away later by saying I was being dramatic or taking things too personally. We called Maya in, and what followed wasn't emotional or theatrical. It was procedural, quiet, and razor-sharp. Maya reviewed the notes, confirmed the timeline, and requested that we prepare a formal internal statement clarifying my role in the projects Brooke had tried to claim. I then requested something I never thought I'd have the guts to ask for. I asked for a slot at the upcoming leadership roundtable our company hosted every quarter, the one where new managers and promoted staff shared their journey, where people got to humanize the faces behind promotions, and where I could, in front of my peers and senior leadership, speak not just about my career, but about what it meant to navigate professional growth while managing personal sabotage from within my own family. The night before the roundtable, I stayed up late, not rewriting my story, but cutting it down to the truth, no poetic details, no digressions, just the facts. How I had worked on the portfolio that brought in the largest client we had last year. How certain credit had gone missing due to internal errors that were later traced to compromised access. How I stayed quiet to protect someone I thought just needed another chance, and how I was done doing that. When I stood up to speak, I didn't mention Brooke by name. I didn't need to. The numbers were there. The projects were there. The turnaround data was there. And when I finished, the silence in the room wasn't awkward. It was respectful, weighty, the kind of silence that says, we didn't know all of that, but now we do. After the session, our communications lead asked if she could share an excerpt on our internal blog, a piece about resilience and clarity under pressure. I agreed. Not because I wanted to go viral, not because I needed applause, but because I knew Brooke's draft was still sitting on her phone, waiting for the moment she felt ignored enough to post it, and now if she did, there would be an official, internally verified version of events already circulating that made hers look exactly like what it was, a tantrum, not a takedown. That same night, I emailed Brooke a single line. If you post that, I'll respond with full documentation and client testimony, and it will be permanent. The response came 2 hours later, not from her, but from my father, in the form of a voicemail so sharp in tone it practically hissed through the speaker. He called me cruel. He said I had turned corporate and forgotten what it meant to be family. And then, with no irony, no hesitation, and clearly no awareness of how insane it sounded, he told me that if I kept going down this path, I'd be written out of the will. I didn't reply. I just saved the voicemail to a folder called Backup. The next morning, compliance sent me a brief, final message, pending one final item. This case is ready for closure. I leaned back in my chair, looked at the screen, and realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before, that I wasn't fighting for survival anymore. I was laying the final stone in the foundation of a life that would finally belong to me, not the one I'd been pressured into performing. And what came next wasn't vengeance. It wasn't rage. It was going to be something smarter. Something that didn't just end the story. It would change the entire frame. I don't think I truly understood what it meant to let go, not just of people, or expectations, or even of some long-clung-to version of justice, until I sat across from my parents that final time. Not in some dramatic setting or under the pretense of reconciliation, but in a small coffee shop chosen not for comfort or nostalgia, but for the simple fact that it was quiet, public, and neutral, a place where raised voices would feel out of place, and where I could finally speak without being cornered into the emotional ambushes that used to happen in kitchens, on porches, and in long car rides where I had nowhere to escape, because I knew, even before I walked in, that I wasn't there to be convinced, to be softened, or to be swayed back into the role I'd finally broken free from, but to deliver the final line of a story that I had spent my entire adult life trying to edit without a pen. My mother arrived first, still carrying the nervous energy of someone who hadn't decided whether she was here to make peace or to mediate, while my father followed close behind, His expression already set into that familiar mixture of indignation and paternal authority, as if he expected the very sight of him to realign the conversation into something that would once again tilt in his favor. But I didn't flinch. And I didn't greet them with the obligatory pleasantries I once used to mask discomfort, because there was nothing left to protect, no illusion of harmony to maintain, and when I pulled out my phone and quietly played the voicemail he'd left me, the one about the will, the threats, the disgust in his voice so sharp it practically cracked the audio, I watched, without interruption, as the recognition passed over his face like a slow, tightening knot. He didn't deny it, not this time, didn't scramble to explain or pretend it was taken out of context, and in the absence of that denial, I felt something shift, not in him, but in me. Because for once I didn't feel the urge to explain why it hurt or to justify my reaction to it. I simply let it hang in the air like a mirror too bright to ignore, and then, without ceremony, I slid the envelope across the table. The one containing a letter I had already signed, dated, and notarized a letter. That stated in unambiguous terms that I was formally declining any future inheritance, that I would not be accepting assets, property, financial compensation, or the moral weight of family obligation tied to any legacy that came with strings. And as my father opened the letter and read it, his eyes narrowing with each sentence, I kept my gaze steady, because this wasn't revenge, and it wasn't dramatics, it was a clean break, written in legal clarity, designed not to punish, but to release. "I'm not interested in what's left behind," I said, and my voice was calm, not cold, not angry, just still, the kind of still that comes after a storm has passed, and you realize the house you used to live in was always cracked at the foundation. Because none of it changes what was never given while you were alive, not time, not fairness, not equal ground, and I'm not waiting around for an apology that's tied to a dollar amount. My mother looked away, and for a brief second I saw a flash of something in her, maybe guilt, maybe just exhaustion, but she didn't speak, and I didn't need her to, because I wasn't offering them an invitation to start over. Only a choice to respect the life I had built without them at the center of it. I gave them one offer, one path forward, therapy, if they wanted it, not as a condition for re-entry into my life, but as a prerequisite for any relationship beyond polite distance, and even that wasn't a plea. Just a door I was willing to leave slightly cracked, with the understanding that I would never again knock first. Back at the office, compliance closed the file with a short confirmation email. The case was complete, the investigation sealed, my name cleared across all records, and an internal policy was quietly updated to prevent future conflicts of interest stemming from familial connections, something Maya told me, in a rare moment of candor, would likely become a case study at the next board review. She congratulated me not with a party, not with applause, but by assigning me a new junior hire to mentor, a quiet signal that the chapter had turned, that I wasn't just a survivor of a messy conflict, but now a leader expected to model something better, and I took that seriously, maybe more than anyone knew. But I wasn't done. I had one final move left, not petty, not punitive, but permanent, the kind of move that changes the narrative without needing to drag anyone's name through the mud. I contacted the community college in our city, the one my grandmother had once volunteered at before she passed, the only family member who had ever, without condition, made me feel seen, and I funded a small scholarship in her name. Enough to help a few students a year cover their textbooks and course fees, and in the dedication I wrote something simple but deliberate, in honor of quiet effort and unseen strength for those who keep going when no one claps. The announcement went live in the local paper the following week, a modest listing on page 3, and I knew my parents would see it, because they still subscribed to that paper, still read it with their coffee. And I imagined my father's expression as he read my name in that context, not as someone who needed their approval or their money, but as someone who had rewritten the story without them. I didn't send them a copy. I didn't call. I didn't post it online. I let the truth exist quietly, because I had finally learned that the loudest victory isn't always the one shouted from the rooftops. Sometimes it's the one no one can take from you, the one that doesn't need defending, because it isn't up for debate. That evening, my phone buzzed. A message. "Brooke." One line. "Do you know your true worth?" I stared at it for a long time, then typed back just 3 words. I do now. The message marked as read. No reply came. And for the first time in years, the chat stayed quiet. Not because I'd won in the way people usually measure it, but because I had stopped playing the game.